triangles. Somehow they've become almost too familiar when it comes to the otherworldly. The Bennington Triangle, the Lake Michigan Triangle, and of course the infamous Bermuda Triangle. But there's one that rarely gets the spotlight, and in my opinion it's the one that's actually the most interesting of all of these, because the lore is the least modern, and it actually credibly dates back to Native American superstition. This triangle is the Bridgewater Triangle. Now, to start, despite being shaped like a structural engineer's ideal life partner, this triangle is a bit different than the rest. While most of these superstitious triangles surround endless oceanic expanses or untouched wilderness, the Bridgewater Triangle wraps around cities, threading through towns with a combined population of well over 100,000. It's not a remote void, it's right there under people's feet. And yet they say it's a place where the seams of reality are thin, where reality, legend, and perhaps the line between the living and the dead gets pretty permeable. Inside of these borders, stories pile up. Native American spirits, cursed artifacts, phantom lights, cryptids, UFOs, etc. This isn't just a mystery zone, it's a living campfire story that refuses to go out. Today, we're going to cover this strange triangle from top to bottom, from the Hockomock Swamp, a place where everything from ghosts to mysterious cryptids feared by native people dwell, to the Freetown State Forest, where there's a long dark history of true crime and superstition. About everything from a cliff that beckons you to leap off of it, to ghostly residents that try to lure you permanently into its dark forests. But quickly, before we jump in, I'm T, and this is T's Storytime. If you're into folklore, superstition, historical oddities, and more, you might enjoy this channel. It would really help me out if you'd like, subscribe, and comment on this video. It'll never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyways, with that, grab your flashlight, because we're going into the woods tonight. Let's explore this dark place. At the center of the Bridgewater Triangle lies the Hockomock Swamp, a feature many refer to as the heart of the Bridgewater Triangle. This Hockomock Swamp sprawls across 6 towns, nearly 17,000 acres of twisting reeds and black water. It's the largest freshwater swamp in Massachusetts, a vital organ that filters billions of gallons of water and prevents floods. Now, like most facets of the environment that provides services to us, this place is often neglected and filled with trash at its edges in modern day. But for all its practical value, the Hockomock carries another weight entirely. Long before colonists arrived, it was sacred ground. Its name, Hockomock, tells you a whole lot about this sacred status. Depending on the translation, it means place where the spirits dwell, evil spirit place, or simply haunted place. Whichever translation you choose, the meaning is clear. The Hockomock was always seen as a realm where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. But the thing is, our modern interpretation of ghosts isn't an accurate depiction of how this place was treated by the native people. The spirits in this swamp weren't feared. To the native people of this land, encountering a spirit in the Hockomock wasn't a curse. It was a high honor. These weren't demons or malevolent forces. They were ancestors, long-departed relatives who hadn't quite moved on, and who still wandered the trails and shadowed waterways of the swamp. Perhaps this superstition exists because inside of the swamp, the dead are quite literally beneath your feet. Archaeologists digging here have found an 8,000-year-old native burial site hidden on a grassy island deep within the swamp. According to legend, when they unearthed it, red ochre in the tombs bubbled and dissolved in the water. Also, photographs taken there refused to develop during this unearthing. Also, in a twist that reminds me of the bogs in Lord of the Rings, legends say that if you stare long enough into the still black waters of the Hockomock Swamp, especially at night, you might see eyes staring back. And if you're particularly lucky, you might even see a face rise up from the water, pale and waiting, beckoning you to join them in their murky depths. Now, while 8,000-year-old graves sound pretty old, the swamp's story stretches further back still. See, when crews were clearing land for Interstate 495 in Norton, they found Paleolithic tools and arrowheads, signs of human presence going back over 10,000 years. Massachusetts already has one of the highest densities of prehistoric sites in New England, but this discovery made it clear even the most ancient people found something significant in the Hockomock Swamp. And then there's the serpent. Native legends speak of a colossal black snake in the Hockomock Swamp that surfaces every 7 years from the depths. A being of flesh, but also one that's spiritually significant. The Wampanoag say this serpent represents death itself, or at least the Wampanoag version of death. But don't go picturing a Grim Reaper figure dragging a scythe through the bogs. In their tradition, death isn't evil. It just is. It's a force of nature. It's neither good nor bad. Something you accept, not something you fear. Seeing the serpent, by that logic, wasn't necessarily an omen of doom or anything, just a reminder that all things come to an end, and this god of death lived in the swamp. Of course, when the colonists came, they saw none of this nuance. See, unlike the native people, who had a deep and layered spiritual connection to the swamp, the colonists brought with them a very different worldview, one that didn't leave a lot of room for wandering ancestor spirits or neutral gods of death. To them, the swamp wasn't sacred, it was cursed. They spoke of fog-shrouded figures, phantom drums, phantom fires that gave off no heat, and of course this giant black snake. And there were lights, too. Floating orbs mistaken for travelers. People followed them, and according to the old stories, those that followed these lights into the woods didn't usually come back. The swamp's darkness bled into history too. See, during King Philip's War, the Hockomock became a natural fortress for the Wampanoag warriors. The conflict, named after Wampanoag leader Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, was rooted in colonial encroachment onto native land. Thus, suddenly, this swamp became more than haunted. It became enemy territory, where the Wampanoag were known to launch raids from deep within the swamp's inaccessible terrain. As a result, the swamp became feared, not just as a spiritual site, but as a stronghold of native resistance. To the colonists, it became even more dangerous and unknowable, and perhaps after the war, it became a symbol of the natives' unfinished business. When Metacom, or King Philip, was captured and executed, his head was displayed on a pike for 26 years. If unfinished business exists, that would probably qualify. There was also a strange phenomenon around colonial times known as Yellow Days that was documented by both native people and colonists alike. Records describe skies glowing with a sulphurous yellow light over the swamp, turning daylight sickly and strange with no apparent explanation, and some even suggest these times might have been extra paranormal, with the nights following these days being known for death, spirits, and unexplained occurrences. Even today, the Hockomock doesn't make entry easy. For years, the state left its interior trails unmaintained, relying on hunters and fishermen as its unofficial keepers. Now, realistically, this could be intimately tied to the state's budget for clearing trails, but some, of course, suggest this was a way to keep people away from this ancient and perhaps dangerous location that doesn't actually want to be disturbed. Also, despite all of these spooky details I shared being hundreds of years old, the stories of these wild phenomena haven't stopped. For instance, that serpent we talked about, it didn't seem to go anywhere. There's a famous account that in 1939, 2 workers with the Civilian Conservation Corps, Roosevelt-era guys employed to help combat poverty, were stationed near the edge of the swamp. According to their reports, they witnessed a huge snake, as large around and black as a stovepipe. It coiled, raised its head, and then after looking at them for a bit, it slipped back into the swamp. Not exactly a standard day on the job, I will say. Additionally, maybe this black snake, or at least a large snake population, is still slithering around in the swamp after all, as there are records, as recently as 1970, of a police officer responding to a report from a Bridgewater resident who apparently ran over something unusual in the road, which turned out to be an 8-foot-long boa constrictor. You have to wonder if this driver unknowingly ran over the god of death himself and just kept moving this day. But the swamp doesn't just belong to snakes and spirits. There's something else notable said to live inside of it too. Something with wings. This saga in particular starts around 2 a.m. on a late night in the summer of 1971, when Norton Police Sergeant Thomas Downey was driving home to Easton along Winter Street in Mansfield. He noticed something strange in the road near a hill that, somewhat ironically, locals call Bird Hill. There, just ahead of him, was a massive bird, resting right on the ground. He estimated its wingspan at something between 8 and 12 feet, and when he stopped at the intersection, the creature lifted off the road and disappeared into the swamp, never to be seen again, at least not by Downey. And while he was mocked relentlessly for reporting this sighting, Downey stuck to his story for the rest of his career. And also, he's not alone. In 1988, Kathleen Garner, 69 years old at the time, was moving into her home on Maple Street in West Bridgewater when a quote, giant white prehistoric-looking bird decided to stop by and say hello. According to her account, it stood 6 feet tall, had an 8-foot wingspan, and even had teeth. It paused just long enough to peek into her window, and then it decided to fly off. Imagine that being the first welcome you get in your new house. I'd personally want to move out right then and there. Also, if you think these sightings were maybe relics of the past or 70s and 80s things, think again. In 2018, a woman named Kristen O'Day was dropping off her daughter at Freetown Elementary School when she saw it. Another giant bird, this time with a raptor-like tail, according to her. It was around 8 a.m. on a weekday, and she claimed that others in the child drop-off line saw it too. Kristen, for what it's worth, says that she's an avid bird watcher. And so, according to her, she knows her raptors from her robins, and she swore she'd never seen anything like this before. So hey, who am I to tell a bird watcher she did or did not see a bird? But the strangest, and possibly the most iconic creature associated with the Hockomock Swamp isn't a bird. It's something that walks on 2 legs, referred to as a pukwudgie. With roots in Algonquin, Ojibwe, and Wampanoag folklore, pukwudgies are small, forest-dwelling humanoids about 3 feet tall. They walk upright. They have gray skin, sometimes covered in coarse hair or porcupine-like spines, or both, and despite their nasty behavior, they supposedly smell faintly sweet, kind of like wildflowers, which honestly is a nice break from the usual smells like hot garbage and cryptid BO trend that most folklore creatures tend to follow. Seriously, looking at you, Bigfoot. The name Pukwudgie roughly translates to little person of the wilderness, or little wild man of the woods that vanishes. And vanish they do. These tricksters are known for their supernatural abilities, chief of which is becoming invisible, then shape-shifting, or even exerting control over humans with prolonged eye contact. They shoot poison arrows too, lead people astray, and are blamed for everything from bad luck to full-on disappearances. And worst of all, they command something called the Taipei Wonka. These Taipei Wonkas, which sound like something between a fire spirit and a Final Fantasy character, are basically living ghost lights. According to lore, they were once people, specifically native individuals who were killed by pukwudgies. After their death, their spirits became little floating flames, bound to serve the creature that killed them. Like the European will-o'-the-wisps, they're used to lure people off of safe paths, usually into swamps, cliffs, or quicksand, where the pukwudgie can finish the job with its little poison arrows. And yes, reports of Taipei Wonkas still crop up around the Hockomock to this day. Stories of pukwudgies go back centuries, but not all of them are ancient history. Actually, one of the most compelling encounters happened in modern day, and it comes from a man named Bill Rousseau, who lived just a few hundred yards from the Hockomock Swamp in Raynham during the 1990s. He worked the swing shift, 3 p.m. to midnight, at a local ironworks, and he would take his Shepherd Rottweiler mix, Samantha, out for walks each night when he got home. Samantha wasn't your average dog either. Once, this pup was said to have squared off with a charging bison, and apparently around the house it had no qualms about enforcing order or breaking up fights. If people argued, the dog started barking. She was a bold girl, and every night, Bill and Savannah walked the same route through a patch of forest called the High Tees, which is a 50-foot wide corridor of pine-flanked wilderness beneath electrical lines that runs between Boston and Providence, Rhode Island. It's essentially a back-alley wildlife freeway where foxes, deer, and even the occasional black bear run around to avoid human contact. And at midnight, especially in the 1990s, Raynham was dead quiet. There weren't streetlights. There weren't many pedestrians. There were no police. Seriously, the local department didn't even run a night shift back then. This particular walk started off like any other, too, until they were nearly home. Just 500 feet from their front door, Samantha froze, and she began to whimper and then shake, and she refused to go any further. Bill tried to coax her forward, even bribed her with the promise of dinner, but that's when he heard it. Kier, kier, I want you. Kier, kier, kier. This voice was so high-pitched, almost pleading, and each repetition came louder, more urgent. At first, Bill thought it might be a lost child in the woods. That was until he saw it. A small figure emerged into the glow of a nearby street lamp, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, humanoid, but covered in some fur. It also had a round potbelly, and a face that Bill described as looking like that of a chipmunk. It raised one of its hairy hands and made a beckoning gesture. Kier, chu e wan, chu, kier, I wan chu. It kept making this sort of noise. Bill then asked if the child needed help. Where was his house? Was he okay? But the figure didn't answer. It just kept repeating its strange chant. Now, because of this, Bill inched forward, but Samantha pulled hard in the opposite direction, panicked. Finally, Bill stopped, and he looked more closely, and he realized whatever he was looking at certainly wasn't a child. It wasn't a human, and it wasn't friendly. And thus, instead of going to the creature, he circled wide around the thing and made a break for his house, locking the door behind him. And I find this detail pretty fun. He told his wife straight away, and apparently she didn't think he was crazy. So instead of going to a motel, he spent the rest of the night wide awake, with the words it spoke echoing in his head. "I-wan-chu." What if, he thought, what if this creature wasn't speaking some strange language that he didn't understand? What if it was trying to speak English, he thought. And he came to the conclusion, what if it was saying, instead of "I-wan-chu," "kier," it was trying to say, "We want you. Come here." This incident haunted him, not just because of what he saw, but because of what he almost did. You see, Pukwudgies, they're known for mimicry, and for luring people off the path using imitation and misdirection. And that's exactly what nearly happened to Bill. Maybe, in a strange way, he almost became a Taipei Wonka. Even beyond the lore of the Pukwudgies, the modern strangeness of the Hockomock doesn't stop. Consider the Raynham dog track, for instance. Back in its heyday, it was just a greyhound racing venue, hence the name dog track. But ask locals, and you'll hear stories of strange things. Spooklights, for instance, strange glowing orbs that float along the power lines over the swamp, and sometimes even over the railroad tracks nearby. One report said a bunch of these followed a massive power outage once, drifting in glowing clusters through the swamp. Of course, to many, the fact that these lights once followed a power outage suggests that this might be an electrical phenomenon, but others aren't so sure, largely because these lights date back to well before these power lines were ever put in place. See, according to historians, there are actually 18th century accounts of villagers in the Bridgewater area observing glowing orbs flying over the Hockomock Swamp in January, and further written accounts from October 31st of 1908 of folks seeing something glide over the swamps that was, I quote, "colored like the sky but jumping across the swamp." Also, more than lights are showing themselves in the vicinity of this dog track too. For instance, in the 90s, a security guard at the dog track reported hearing blood-curdling screams and howls that upset the kenneled dogs they were keeping there. Now, being a responsible steward of the track, he of course decided to go and ensure whatever was making these noises wouldn't be a threat to the dogs, and he followed the noises into the nearby woods like an expendable character from a horror movie. Regardless, on this snowy evening, he didn't find what was making the noises, but he did stumble upon 18-inch human-like footprints leading away from the area that were, I quote, "deep, heavy, and far too large to belong to any human." Also, speaking of big footprints, these footprints around the dog track weren't alone. For instance, there's the curious story of John Baker, as well as a number of other strange tales of large hairy beasts that call these woods home. In John Baker's case, he was no stranger to the Hockomock Swamp. At 48 years old, he spent more than 3 decades hunting, trapping, and working in and around the dense, marshy wilderness near his home in West Bridgewater, Massachusetts. He knew the rhythms of the swamp, its moods and its shadows, but one winter evening in the early 1980s, he would encounter something fresh about it. That night, John had set out to catch muskrats on a canoe. He was traveling light, just himself and his canoe paddling along the quiet, semi-icy stretches of the Hockomock Swamp about a mile from his house. As a seasoned hunter, he was armed with a rifle, and that was routine. The deeper he got into the swamp, though, the more he felt a creeping sensation, like something was watching him, and then he started to occasionally hear strange sounds being made by something big, something dangerous, at least in his estimation. Then, in the shallow part of the river ahead, the stillness shattered. Apparently a large hairy creature, something massive and bear-like according to his description, burst its leg into the ice as it took a step and began wading through the frigid waters. It also wasn't just the sight of this that struck him. The smell hit him just as hard. It was apparently strong, filthy, and pungent, like a skunk, John would later say, like it lived in the dirt. In all of his years working in that swamp, John Baker had never seen anything like it, and after that, he never forgot it. Then there was Joseph DeAndrade, a former security guard who had his own chilling encounter in the Hockomock Swamp back in 1978. While out in the swamp, he turned around and caught sight of something he couldn't explain. Apparently a large, hairy creature that was about 200 feet away from him. He saw it moving through the undergrowth. It wasn't running or hiding, it was walking, slowly and deliberately. I quote, like Frankenstein, as it disappeared into the brush. DeAndrade was shaken enough by the experience to report it to the local newspaper. Not exactly something you do for fun if you want to remain a credible individual to your local community. Even law enforcement wasn't immune to the strangeness of this Hockomock Swamp monkey or whatever it was. For instance, one local police officer, while lying in wait on a quiet night to survey a neighborhood in Raynham near the swamp, had an encounter that rattled him. According to his report, something came up behind his parked patrol car. He just barely saw movement of it in the rearview mirror of his car before it lifted the entire rear of the vehicle off the ground. And when it was set back down, he jumped out, flashlight in hand, and caught a glimpse of what he thought was a massive hulking figure bolting away on two legs. In the beam of light, he said it looked like a huge bear, walking on two legs. But as we've talked about before, bears don't pick up cop cars as far as I'm aware. Then there's the case of Mark St. Louis and Peter Blumberg, two friends from Brockton, who on October 24th of 1980 found themselves face to face with something that's, let's just say, unusual. The two were paddling around Lake Nippanicket, a body of water that sits right on the edge of the Hockomock Swamp like an ominous little appetizer to the main course of weird. The lake, lovingly called the Nip by locals, has its own share of lore, but on this particular day, it gave them something new to chew on. As they approached one of these small, brush-covered islands on the lake, they spotted a creature sitting there. It wasn't a heron, or a beaver, or anything else you might expect to find in a Massachusetts swamp. According to Mark and Peter, it looked like a small, orange orangutan, just sitting there, on an island, in the middle of southern New England. This wasn't some shadow in the fog, or blurry shape in the water. It was, to them at least, clear, vibrant orange, and unmistakably ape-like. It didn't seem aggressive or anything, just really out of place. Like it took a wrong turn in Borneo, and ended up knee-deep in the land of clam chowder and Red Sox fans. Whether it was an escaped exotic pet, a hoax, or something truly unexplained, no one ever really offered a definitive answer. But the story of this so-called swamp ape added another mystery to the Hockomock's Swamp already overstuffed paranormal resume. And also, don't think for 1 second that the Hockomock Swamp is only home to strange beasts, phantom birds, and pint-sized murder goblins. Because if there's one flavor of weirdness this place doesn't skimp on, it's the supernatural kind. The ghost stories, the spectral women and men, and the deeply haunted echoes of grief that seem to live on and breathe in the bogs. One story in particular stands out. It's sad, it's unique, and it taps into a superstition that some of the early colonists carried with them into the New World, that women, specifically English women, were especially susceptible to the horrors of the Hockomock Swamp. Something about the place, they thought, just unraveled them. Also, trust me, I'm no fan of the sentiment that women can't handle the horrors of these supernatural places like this swamp. Don't shoot the messenger, I'm just telling the story. Regardless, this legend tells of a young woman living near what's now the southern edge of the swamp, modern-day Raynham, in the 1700s, and by all accounts, she was a decent sort of person, but she had one fatal flaw. She fell in love with the wrong guy, a poor guy. Her father, of course, had other plans. This was a time when marrying well meant more than just finding someone who didn't track mud in the house. He wanted her to align with wealth, and if he'd have it his way, he'd have her marrying someone that got his coffee at Tate rather than Dunkin'. Of course, she chose love over status. This guy had nothing, but she picked him anyways. But what she didn't know, however, or maybe didn't care about, was that he was sick with something. Not lovesick, but like actual sickness. Regardless, they married, and they had a swamp, and they lived modestly in the swamp's edge. For a while, things were okay, quiet, peaceful even. It wasn't a fairy tale, but they were together. That is, until his ailment caught up with him, and he passed away, leaving her a widow. But the story doesn't stop there. She stayed here, in the swamp, raising her son alone in the same corner of the Hockomock where they'd lived before. And then her cough began, the same one as the husband's. It was slow and persistent, and eventually it left her breathless and weak, and then she too passed away, leaving behind her son, not even a teenager yet, to fend for himself in the heart of the Hockomock Swamp. But despite the fact that his mother passed away, she didn't stay gone, not really. To this day, people report sightings of a glowing blue figure, a woman draped in a flowing, billowing dress, gliding silently through the swamp's shadows. She doesn't take footsteps and she doesn't make sounds, with the exception of the gentle ripple of fabric and a faint blue light in the dark that indicates her. Some say that she glides through this swamp, still searching for her son, still lingering in the place where she refused to leave him behind all those years ago. Now, on paper, this might sound like your classic lady in white ghost story, but the thing is, this one comes with a twist and maybe a little bit of credibility, because if you dig deep enough, I mean really deep, you'll find sparse records that back it up, at least in part. One account, buried in local history, tells of a man who claimed that he grew up in the swamp itself, and that he was raised there by his mother until her passing, around the time he turned 9 or 10. He lived, he grew up, and he stayed in the region, eventually working as a bog iron miner, right there in the same swamp that had once been his childhood home, and his mother's final resting place. So maybe, just maybe, there's a shred of credibility that says that this glowing woman is still watching from the reeds, and it isn't just some low-stakes ghost story. Maybe there's a reality where she really is keeping an eye out for her boy, waiting for him to come home long after he already did. Of course, that ghostly woman drifting through the southern edge of the swamp isn't the only spirit said to linger in these parts. In fact, if you're looking for what many locals and paranormal investigators alike consider the most haunted spot in the entire Bridgewater Triangle, you'd do well to head just west of the Hockomock Swamp, north of the Winnicunnet Pond in Norden. There, tucked among the trees and rocks, is a location known as King Philip's Cave. As the name suggests, this rocky overhang is tied to none other than Metacom, also known as Metacomet, or more commonly to the colonists and modern folks, King Philip, the Wampanoag sachem, or chief, who led his people during the bloody conflict that we mentioned known as King Philip's War. This cave is said to be one of the final hideouts Metacom used before retreating south towards modern-day Bristol, Rhode Island, when it became clear that the war was lost. His fate, as grim history tells it, didn't come at the hands of English Puritans, but rather from within his own people. He was killed by a fellow Wampanoag, one of the so-called praying Indians, a term for native individuals who had converted to Christianity. This particular man that took his life, John Alderman, was reportedly led to Metacomet by English officer Benjamin Church, and together they brought an end to the Wampanoag resistance in perhaps the most brutal way possible. Metacomet, after being shot and beheaded, was drawn and quartered. His head would be displayed on a pike in Plymouth for over 2 decades, a cruel punctuation mark on one of the bloodiest chapters in early American history, ultimately concluding with King Philip's head being buried in an unknown location, somewhere between modern-day Taunton and Mount Hope in Bristol, Rhode Island. But if the colonists thought that would silence him, they were sorely mistaken, because to this day, King Philip's Cave is said to be very much alive with activity. Visitors claim that if you dare approach the cave at night, you might see orbs, or what some like me might call dust if they're in a skeptical mood, floating lazily through the air. Others report hearing faint drumming echoing from the trees or voices speaking in Algonquian. They're words, unintelligible but deeply unsettling. And then there's the fire. There are numerous reports of people spotting a flickering campfire, burning right outside of the cave's mouth, an orange glow dancing on the rocks like a beacon. But if you get closer, you'll find something isn't quite right. You'll reach out your hands towards the fire, and you'll feel nothing. No heat, no warmth, no crackling embers, just light, almost a ghost of a campfire, if you will. A memory of a long-extinguished flame, still flickering on some supernatural loop. And sometimes, if you're lucky, or maybe unlucky depending on your point of view, you might catch a glimpse of Metacom himself. Often he appears huddled deep in the shadows of the cave, brooding, silent, and very much not interested in you. Other times he's been seen standing atop the tallest rock near the entrance, scanning the horizon, perhaps still searching for a path forward in a war that ended centuries ago. Either way you slice it, usually you won't be spoken to by the ghost of Metacom. He's usually silent, even if you call out to him. But as the legend goes, about every 3 generations, a lucky few, usually medicine men, will have the location of his buried head told to them by his spirit. And they are the only ones who get to hear words come from Metacom's mouth in modern day. But it doesn't end there. Sightings have also been reported on the waters themselves, on Winnicunnett Pond, and in the winding streams of the Hockomock Swamp. Canoes, barely visible, sometimes glide across the glassy surfaces, paddled by slightly translucent figures in native dress. They move slowly, always towards King Philip's Cave, perhaps bringing word of some long-finished battle. And while it technically lies outside of the Hockomock Swamp proper, there's one location that seems spiritually, and maybe even supernaturally, tethered to it by the waters that flow downstream. This place is known as Solitude Stone, and while it doesn't sit within the swamp's official borders, as I said, it feels like something the swamp spit out and couldn't quite keep a hold of, resting near the connected waters of the town river. The Solitude Stone is, at first glance, just a rock along the edge of the Nuckatesset River, a peaceful stream that winds its way out of the Hockomock's marshy veins, but carved into its surface, barely legible now, is a strange, melancholy message. It reads, "All ye who in future days walk by Nuckatesset stream, love not him who hummed his lay, cheerful to the parting beam, but the beauty that he wooed in his quiet solitude." It's got the tone of something you'd find scratched into the wall of a lonely poet's cabin, and that's really not far off. This verse was penned by Reverend Timothy Otis Payne of Winslow, Maine, around 1852. But this isn't just a forgotten bit of 19th century emo core etched into a river rock. The stone has gained a reputation over the decades, both for its odd placement and, more disturbingly, for the tragedies tied to it. See, the Solitude Stone was forgotten for quite a while, but it re-emerged into public consciousness in 1916, when it was rediscovered under grim circumstances. During the search for a missing woman named Evelyn Packard. Evelyn, you see, had vanished under mysterious conditions, and her body was eventually found not far from the stone itself. Some speculated, even then, that her descent into whatever darkness claimed her had started in the Hockomock Swamp, as if the place had marked her and sent its madness trickling downstream like oil in water. Dig a bit deeper into the stone's history, and the strangeness doesn't even stop with Evelyn. In 1880, a man named John Crane reportedly also took his own life near this stone. What brought him to this exact spot remains unclear, but after his passing, stories began to swirl, ones that claimed both Crane and Evelyn never quite left. Paranormal investigators have since flocked to this stone, treating it as a sort of haunted waypoint on the Bridgewater Triangle map. Now, I'll be honest, if you're expecting something jaw-dropping from this spot, you might walk away disappointed. Reports from Solitude Stone tend to fall into the greatest hits category of haunted locations. Here you'll feel cold spots, distant rustling from beyond the tree line, and the occasional burst of the electronic voice phenomena. Eerie, yes. Chilling, maybe, but nothing so concrete that it could be held up as definitive proof of the afterlife. And that brings us to the edge of the Hockomock Swamp. But don't think we're leaving it behind. Its shadow stretches across the entire Bridgewater Triangle, threading into every legend. Outside of the swamp, there's one particular story I can't ignore. A single piece of stone that has fascinated, confused, and haunted people for centuries, named Dighton Rock. For hundreds of years, it sat half-submerged in the Taunton River in Berkeley, Massachusetts, a 40-ton boulder, 5 feet high, 9.5 feet wide, and 11 feet long. This land once belonged to their neighboring town of Dighton, and locals gave the boulder the simplest of names because of that, Dighton Rock, in the town's honor. And what makes it strange isn't its size, it's what's carved into it. The surface is covered in petroglyphs, lines, geometric shapes, cryptic symbols, even figures that might very well be human, like those I'm showing on the screen right now. What they mean, or who carved them, has been a question for more than 3 centuries. The first recorded mention of this stone came in 1680, when Reverend John Danforth, a Harvard graduate, stumbled across the rock and sketched these markings. His conclusion was dramatic. He believed these symbols told the story of an encounter, and maybe even a battle, with travelers who arrived by ship. That drawing survives today in the British Museum, the first surviving record of what would become one of North America's longest-running mysteries. By 1690, the rock was already a curiosity. Puritan minister Cotton Mather actually wrote about it, calling it one of New England's wonders. He would say, among the other curiosities of New England, one is that of a mighty rock, very deeply engraved. No man alive knows how or when. Strange characters, which would suggest as odd thoughts about them that were here before us, as there are odd shapes in that elaborate monument. Also, keep in mind, I was cutting a bit of the fat out of that script. I was just telling you the highlights. For almost 300 years, the rock sat in that river after being discovered by Westerners, the tide covering and uncovering its strange face. Then in 1963, construction of a coffer dam forced its removal, and in 1971 it found its permanent home, a small museum inside Dighton Rock State Park. That's where it rests now, a mystery behind glass, albeit the markings are far more eroded than they used to appear in old photos, or I guess the one old photo we have. As for theories about this rock's origin, they stretch from the mundane to the fantastic. In 1783, Ezra Stiles proposed that ancient Phoenicians carved it. In 1837, Danish scholar Carl Christian Raffen claimed that it was proof Norse explorers reached New England. In 1912, others saw a faint M core carved into the rock and argued it stood for Miguel Cortereal, a 1511 Portuguese explorer that was lost at sea. If true, the story went, he became chief of the local natives, this is quite the reach, and perhaps even fathered children. Of course, there's no evidence for this at all beyond an old rumor of light-skinned native tribes and centuries of speculation. The theories kept coming, too. For instance, in 2002, Gavin Minzey's historical fiction book proposed that the Chinese explorers left the carvings. Many archaeologists, though, believed the answer was closer to home, that Native Americans etched the symbols, and that their meaning is now swallowed by time. Even the rock's placement feels deliberate. It faced outwards, towards the sea. Some take this to mean that this may have been a message to arriving Europeans, maybe a warning to them. Some even wonder if maybe it wasn't a message at all. Maybe it was something ordinary, a record, a memory, or even just children carving idle shapes into stone, not knowing they were etching themselves into history. Whatever the truth, Dighton Rock has become more than just a boulder. It's a blank canvas for a legend, a silent monument where people have projected their stories for over 300 years. And inside the Bridgewater Triangle, where reality already runs thin, a rock like that feels less like an artifact and more like a signal. Dighton Rock isn't the only stone in this region that carries a story. Travel a little bit further south, and you'll find another boulder, bound more so to the Bridgewater Triangle's darker history, and less so to strange historical mysteries. Anawan Rock in Rehoboth, Massachusetts. This rock was named after Anawan, a Wampanoag leader, a sachem, who rose to power in the later stages of King Philip's War. When Metacom fell in 1676, Anawan didn't want to lay down his weapons. He gathered what remained of his people and carried on the fight in King Philip's honor. Late that August, just weeks after Metacom's death, Anawan and his men took refuge at a rocky outcrop perched above a swamp. Some say he knew this would be his last stand. The location wasn't random either. The rock's height and steep approach made it defensible, but there was more to this area than strategy. Legends claim the swamp itself held power. The Wampanoag believed spirits, like Hockomock, a deity often equated with death but not the same as that snake we talked about earlier, were close in places like this, aiding shamans and warriors alike. Whether these spirits were listening or not, Anawan sadly didn't escape. On August 28th of 1676, Captain Benjamin Church of Plymouth Colony found him, and despite promising safety to Anawan, he was executed, and his head was displayed on a pike beside that of Metacom's. Some, of course, say that this betrayal of the word of the colonists lingers. Today, Anawan Rock is said to echo with what happened here. Visitors report ghostly campfires flickering atop the boulder, just like those at King Philip's Cave, and their smoke drifts high above the trees. They also sometimes hear whispers in Algonquin, and soft drumming on still nights. Some also claim to make out a single word carried on the wind, Lutash, a word that in Algonquin means keep fighting. Follow that whisper south though, and you'll step into a forest that many consider the Triangle's most cursed ground. the Freetown Fall River State Forest. This forest is 5,441 acres of dense woodland. By day, it's quiet, a state park like any other, but by night, it's been called one of the most haunted forests in America. The origin of this haunted nature supposedly dates back to the fact that the Wampanoag once held something sacred here, something they called the wampum belt. Wampum, like a belt made of wampum, or purple and white shell beads, which carried memory, ceremony, and power. According to the stories, King Philip guarded this ceremonial belt until the end, and when he knew death was near, he passed this belt on to Anawan at Profile Rock, a cliffside formation that many believe bears the face of a man, possibly Metacom himself, a formation that was inside of Freetown Fall River State Forest until it collapsed back in 2019. But when Anawan fled Church's men inside of the forest, the belt vanished. He lost it, and it was lost among the trees and the swamp. They say because of that, it's somewhere still in this park, and that its loss left a wound that the forest has never fully healed from spiritually. Thus, strange things supposedly happen here. For instance, pukwudgies, those small little trickster-like figures from Wampanoag folklore we talked about, are said to be attracted to these woods. Hikers claim to see these small people darting between trees, or they're sometimes lured off trail by tiny ghost lights. They're little Taipei Wonkas, as they're called, the wandering souls of deceased native people of the past that are controlled by these small pukwudgie beings. And there are places inside the forest that feel wrong, too. Assinet Ledge is one of them. This ledge is an 80-foot granite cliff left over from 19th century quarrying. Some, of course, come to the cliff to jump for fun. Others don't. For instance, in 2004, a man with no history of mental illness walked up to this edge in front of his girlfriend and simply stepped off without a word. Now, survivors of this ledge speak of an overwhelming urge to jump, as if something in the water is calling their name. Others have even reported strange lights floating beneath the surface as they gaze downward, or robed figures wading through the pond below, chanting in a language they don't quite recognize. And then there's the Lady of the Ledge, a spectral woman in white who appears at the cliffside at night. If you call to her and say, "Don't jump," she leaps. But afterwards, there's never a splash. She doesn't hit the water. 1 second she's there, and the next, nothing. Also, above the trees, the strangeness continues. For instance, many strange lights have been seen by aviators passing over this forest, and I even found a couple of sources touting the dubious but nonetheless existent claim that President Ronald Reagan saw lights over this forest as he was aboard Air Force One. But admittedly, I think this claim is false. But the darkest stories here are not folklore. They are very real and fall into the realm of true crime rather than the supernatural. For instance, on September 8th of 1978, a 15-year-old woman vanished while riding her bike home, and a week-long search turned up nothing, only for 2 months later her body to be found tied to a tree off of Coppicut Road. The next year, 19-year-old Doreen Ann Levesque was taken out outside a Fall River high school, and the investigation uncovered a network of ritualistic attacks, a saga that would ultimately come to be known as the Fall River Cult Murders. Within months, 2 more women, Barbara Raposa and Karen Marston, were also found to be lost in this saga. Rumors also persisted of an abandoned, I quote, ice shack deep in this forest, tied to the spree of attacks, though whether this place exists or where it was remains a mystery to this day. A single photograph of this ice shack where all of these ritualistic attacks occurred is all that fuels the legend. Also, retired Freetown detective Alan Alves, who is controversial and who worked on these cases, claimed to have found evidence of occult activity for years after these cases. He said he found animal carcasses drained of blood, inverted crosses, and even an underground bunker buried in the woods. Here's a photo of this supposed bunker. They say that it was tied as well to these ritualistic attacks. With that kind of history, it's no surprise the forest is called haunted. And some even think it's these victims that continue to plague the place into modern day. One common ghost story often associated with this so-called satanic activity is a strange phantom pickup truck. Drivers report this phantom pickup truck tries to force their cars off of Coppicut Road near the park. Campers have also reported to hear Algonquian voices, whispering just beyond the glow of their fires. Some claim to hear screaming, sometimes in English too. And those voices heard in English are often believed to be the voices of those that were taken from us in this forest, still echoing through the trees. Between pukwudgies, the lights in the sky, the ghosts, and the very real blood spilled beneath this canopy, the Freetown Fall River State Forest has become the darkest corner of the Bridgewater Triangle. Leave the shadow of the Freetown Fall River Forest, though, and head north, and the strangeness doesn't fade. It just kinda changes shape. Easton, Massachusetts is a quiet little town with a pond called Mill Pond. On the shore, a sign here stands today that reads, Mill Pond, site of the sawmill, built by John Soleil in the 18th century, and continued by his son Nathan, a wizard who purportedly used satanic imps to run the mill at night. Now that line alone should be enough to make you stop and stare. A state-sanctioned marker calling someone a wizard isn't something you come across every day. The story behind this legend, though, begins in 1755, when a man that was mentioned, named John Soleil, built a sawmill here to produce lumber for the town. Under John's care, the mill had been nothing more than a successful business, the kind of unremarkable business venture that quietly held a community together. His son Nathan, though, Nathan's stories had sharper edges. According to the accounts that survived, Nathan inherited this sawmill along with an unusual fascination for the forbidden, specifically the occult. It was said that his interests didn't go unnoticed either, and one night the devil himself came calling, luring Nathan into the swamp with a promise of a deal. Nathan agreed to follow him, bringing with him a book. Some claimed it was a grimoire, others just called it a strange old book whose pages whispered secrets. Regardless, when he was with the devil, he opened it, and the night split open with a sudden storm, wind tearing through the trees as if the swamp itself had woken up. But something about this storm scared him, and he clutched the book and fled for home. And in his panic, he tossed this book that caused the storm into the fire, that caused the pages to curl and blacken in the flames, and apparently that ended the storm. Also, to be clear, this story doesn't entirely make sense, but this is how I found it written in every single source. But regardless, this book being used to start a storm, I guess, upset the devil, and he was further upset by Nathan running away, and so he gave chase to Nathan. And as the devil tore through the darkness, he eventually reached the river, and there, on a slick rock, something caught. The devil slipped, and when he steadied himself, he left more than just a handprint. The legend says the rock sitting there today still bears the mark of his foot, a mark that's 24 inches long and 10 wide, a single burned-in footprint that no storm, no flood, or no hand could erase. And they say that after that night, things at the mill were never the same. Townsfolk started whispering of strange noises drifting from the building long after dark. Some swore they heard the gears grinding and the saw shrieking, with no one there to work them. One man, Tom O'Shatner, claimed he saw this himself on a moonless walk home. The mill was apparently alive and moving, as though invisible hands were running it. And that was when stories of satanic imps began. Now, regardless of these stories, by 1792, the sawmill had been abandoned, left to rot until the forests reclaimed it. Nathan lived on for another 20 or so years, dying at 82. His gravestone still stands near the pond today, and though some argued it was only his father buried there, the stone bears Nathan's name, as clear as the rock in the river that bore the devil's footprint. The triangle's strangeness doesn't stop with ghostly mills either. It has claws and teeth as well. For instance, for centuries, locals have told stories of massive black dogs roaming the area, hulking spectral things with eyes that burn like coal. Alongside them came tales of phantom panthers, mountain lions that no one could ever catch, and great cats that appeared and vanished like smoke. Admittedly, many stories conflate these creatures, dogs and cats, and they are often regarded as one and the same. But there are a few more specific stories about them. For instance, in 1972, the stories grew so loud that police organized an actual lion hunt. Residents here were losing cattle and sheep, their bodies were left kind of shredded and marked with deep, unnatural claw wounds, and it bears noting that there were reports of something akin to Bigfoot through local cattle too. But admittedly, usually it was said that this was like a cat or dog-like creature. Also, in 1976, Abington fell under a different kind of fear, with witnesses describing a massive black dog that was so large it rivaled the ponies in the area, whose throats it was seen tearing out. And this led schools to keep children inside at recess, and the police fielded apparently over 1,000 calls in a matter of days regarding folks seeing these big dogs. And then, of course, just as suddenly as it appeared, the beast was gone. Also, in case you thought that everything was a creature or a Native American spirit, there's apparently a spirit of a relatively modern individual along Route 44 that you might run into while you're in the Bridgewater Triangle. This takes place on a part of Route 44 named the Rehoboth-Seekonk Line, a stretch of road with a story that's a little newer than most of those in the Triangle. One that drivers tell in a hushed voice, that of the red-headed hitchhiker. People say that if you drive this road after dark, you might see him. His thumb will be out. He'll be wearing a red flannel shirt. Sometimes they say he's clean-shaven. Other times he's wild and unkempt. But regardless, he's always walking the roadside like he's been here forever. Drivers, of course, in the area are pretty nice, so they'll stop and they'll let him in their car. And every time, without fail, the first glance back finds the seat behind them where the hitchhiker sat down empty. Those who didn't stop told stranger stories. Headlights might catch him full on, the body solid, and the impact inevitable, with the man in front of their car and them going about 40 miles an hour. But then, the car will pass right through him, kind of like smoke. Sometimes they'll look in the rearview mirror and they won't see anybody there. But sometimes they'll look backwards in the rearview mirror and they'll see he's sitting in the back seat of their car, almost as if they caught the hitchhiker after driving through him. Regardless, this haunted hitchhiker isn't really a friendly ghost who needs a ride. Sometimes he will just get in your car and disappear and leave it at that, but other times he's described as looking kinda evil. His eyes might be looking wrong, like black as pits or something. Or other times they might glow yellow in the dark, kinda like those of depictions of the devil. And on rare nights, he might even speak, but his voice, it won't be human. It's super deep. Again, evoking imagery of the devil, and apparently even after he disappears, you can sometimes hear it. You might even hear it through your radio, and sometimes he'll mock you and laugh at you as you drive down the road. The most infamous story of this hitchhiker actually goes back to the 1970s. And in this old tale, a couple's car broke down on Route 44, leaving the woman behind in the car. The man apparently actually saw the hitchhiker first. He saw him, he actually walked by him while he was standing on the side of the road. The man, walking for help, actually tried to speak to this hitchhiker, but this caused the man to start screaming at him and chasing the man that was trying to go get gasoline or something. And then the hitchhiker vanished. But while his form vanished, his voice remained, and eventually turned into mockery and laughter, which echoed through the trees, following the stranded motorist all the way back to his car after he got gas. Then, once they were back at the car, the woman never saw the hitchhiker, but she did hear him. According to the story, while the woman was sitting there by herself in the car, waiting for her husband to come back with gasoline, the radio clicked on by itself, and his voice filled the empty cabin, mocking her and her situation until she got out of the car and walked away. Now, as for any explanation for this hitchhiker, some say that he might have been the spirit of a farmer that was struck and killed on a nearby road in the region. But this farmer was known to be nice, so a lot of other people dismissed that. Others believe he might be something older, maybe a piece of the triangle itself that just happened to take the shape of a modern-day hitchhiker. And then, finally, we come to the lights in the sky. For centuries, strange objects have been seen moving over the Bridgewater Triangle. Now, we've talked about some of these already. Many of them are what we'd call spooklights. And the earliest accounts fall into this bucket, going as far back as the 18th century, when villagers near the swamp reported a glowing orb drifting silently above the wetlands. Also, as I said, on Halloween night in 1908, something eerily akin to a spooklight, but characterized as moving somewhat intelligently, was witnessed racing across the same stretch of sky. Whatever it was bright enough to light up the marshes below, and it left people whispering about omens for years afterwards. But it was in the late 1970s when the phenomenon truly took hold, and it started to be reported in a more modern lens. See, during the summer of 1978, dozens of sightings were reported of, I quote, crafts gliding through the skies above the Bridgewater Triangle. These strange lights hovered low over the treetops and glided along the massive power lines that cut through the swamp, just like the spooklights from before. Witnesses described them as moving with purpose, almost as if searching for something buried in the wetlands. Then came the sighting on March 23rd of 1979, a night now etched in local UFO lore. On this evening, Jerry Lopes, a radio newsman for WHDH in Boston, was driving near the intersection of routes 24 and 106, close to the Bridgewater Center, when his car suddenly stalled. Dozens of vehicles around him, too, sputtered to a stop at that same moment, and that was when he saw it. He looked up, and he saw a massive craft shaped like a home plate on a baseball diamond. Its edges lined with alternating red and white lights, and a single pulsing red beacon glowed at its top, while the point shone a blinding white headlight, so bright that it cut through the night like a search beam. It hung there in the darkness, silent and massive, in front of the stalled cars, briefly before vanishing into the void just as quickly as it appeared. Another WHDH reporter, Steve Braccia, witnessed the same object that night. They were, of course, together, and he claimed it was, I quote, as wide as 5 side-by-side 747s, a floating giant, hovering just above the Massachusetts backroads. This sighting made headlines in an article called Mysterious Balloon Over Bridgewater, and UFOs Over Randolph. Some persons say yes, which I find to be hilarious. And the encounters didn't stop there. In Rehoboth, patrons at Joseph's restaurant sat in sudden darkness when the power failed in the 1980s, and when the lights came back on, it was reported that 2 perfect circles had been burned into the dirt behind the building, as though something impossibly heavy had landed and left without a sound, perhaps cutting the power in the process. In Lakeville that same year, Brittany Mastera and her friends were sitting around a campfire when the woods suddenly went white. A silent beam of light, like a massive spotlight, poured down over them from nowhere. They looked up expecting to see a helicopter or a plane, but the sky was of course empty, except for a, I quote, home plate-shaped craft. So, in case it isn't clear, the 70s and 80s were filled to the brim with reports of strange aerial phenomena in this proverbial triangle. Even today, people claim to see lights moving in deliberate arcs over the swamp, often clustering over the high-tension lines that slice through the wetlands. They appear, vanish, and reappear again, perhaps drawing power from the lines like they're little UFO streetcar hybrids or something. And with that, I want to leave you with a few parting words. Hopefully at this point you agree with me that the Bridgewater Triangle is pretty strange, and it might even be stranger in a supernatural sense than the Bennington Triangle to the north that we talked about a few weeks ago, and I think it's a little more credible, at least in terms of historic folklore, than the Bermuda Triangle to the south. That being said, I do have some remarks on how to put on our thinking caps and explain some of this aforementioned strangeness. We are modern folks, after all, so maybe some of these strange occurrences witnessed by people of old will feel a bit more normal to us. To start, something that stood out to me starkly as perhaps explainable was those yellow skies we mentioned, the yellow days as colonists put it. Don't get me wrong, if I saw a yellow sky in the morning, I'd probably be scared. But this fear would maybe be more from an air quality perspective, because, let's be real, those of us who have experienced the effects of wildfire smoke recently have absolutely seen days with yellowish skies, whether on the news or in person. Who's to say these yellow skies weren't a symptom of Canadian wildfires in the 17 or 1800s, fires these colonists wouldn't have had knowledge of and had no way of predicting, but their dust still could have easily meandered its way into the upper atmosphere over New England, causing the skies to be a different shade than normal. Also, regarding these spooklights, I find it pretty interesting that these are seen most frequently when the weather is cool, and that they seem to travel near power lines. This in particular reminded me of the Hooker Man legend in New Jersey. Essentially, strange lights were floating over an abandoned rail line in New Jersey for the better part of a century. But the thing is, these lights went away alongside the rail lines being pulled up. In other words, it seems like that legend may have been an electrical phenomenon after all. I have to wonder if these spooklights here in the Hockomock Swamp are similar. I mean, they're even traveling along powered cable, so that lends even more credence. Also, the only time in real life I've ever witnessed swamp gas ignition was in the Hockomock Swamp. I think I actually mentioned this in my old and worst performing video ever on America's historical UFOs, so I have to toss that into the bucket of plausibility too. I even wonder if this phenomenon is how you explain occasional Type A Wonka legends. Also, to be clear, this whole explainable thing cuts both ways, so I may as well concede on some fronts. For instance, regarding sightings of Bigfoot and literal orangutans in the Hockomock Swamp, I don't really have a good rebuttal. Sure, bears have been known to wander into these swamps from time to time, but these swamps are hardly part of their even expanding range. There isn't a known living population of black bears here. Therefore, I have no way to explain the abundance of sightings of, I quote, bears walking upright. And I definitely don't know how to explain the one that lifted up a cop car. And I don't even know where to start with the orangutan, other than proposing someone might have lost their illegally owned pet? I don't know. Anyways, that's about all I have today. Hopefully this one wasn't weird. I felt like it was a little bit scattered, but that's just kind of how the Bridgewater Triangle is. It's just a bucket where you can put pretty much anything strange, from zombies I saw brief reports of, to Bigfoot, to UFOs, to ghosts, to pukwudgies, I guess. Anything weird, throw it in the Hockomock Swamp. Otherwise, as always, and most importantly, whether a bear lifted up the rear of your car at a red light, or if a pukwudgie showed up to your job interview dressed in a polo and said, "We want you, come here," before offering you a position in the company, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.